Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. And welcome back for part 2 with our special guest, Bob Schaffer, as we talk about the American culture war and how we as citizens can stand up and be courageous and make a persuasive argument for individual liberty and the American way. Here we go. I think what I'm encouraging parents to do, and I want your opinion on this. I know that you're for school choice. You're for giving parents the opportunity to make those decisions. My take is if the school isn't educating your kids the way you want them to, you have to make a different decision, whether that's homeschooling or finding a charter school that is in alignment with your values, or finding co-ops or private school or whatever the other type of education is. Part of what we want is we want the money that goes into the education of the kid to go with the kid to whatever educational choice those parents make. You've got a lot of experience in this area. What are the solutions here?
Well, there are solutions at multiple levels. Let's start. I'll just make a simple statement about the most obvious, and that is, yes, the education of your child is one of the most fundamental and important responsibilities a parent has when it comes to raising their children. So if your child is receiving a poor or substandard education in your community, you should do whatever it takes. Beg, borrow, call your parents and ask for help and assistance. Set up a GoFundMe page, whatever it takes to get your kid into a better school. You should sacrifice whatever it takes to. In fact, I won't even use the word that's not a sacrifice. That is what parents do. And so that's the most obvious answer. But you mentioned the money. There is an enormous amount of, the reason public education in America has become such a corrupt representation of our government on every level is because, Jimmy, this is where the money is. There is more money being spent on education in America than anything else. And I say, and that is true when you step back and consider the totality, which I can't even calculate. So sure, we can think about state education budgets, local district education budgets, and the U.S. Department of Education. But add into that all other education expenditures and higher education, loans, insurance programs, the retirement funds for all the workers in universities and in school districts. Insurance plans that cover all these workers through their employment, bonds for borrowing and new capital construction projects. And so once you throw all the cash, consider all of the cash involved in the education industry. It is far and away the place where we see the largest amounts of money coursing through government agencies and bureaucracies. All right. So you can't ignore that. So to acknowledge that, the next question then becomes, well, how can we attach a little more freedom or customer orientation to how these dollars flow toward parent choices? And that's where the political battles tend to be. So we should be for, anything that moves, that empowers parents to make the most important choices about children, rather than a government worker making the most important decisions about your child. So charter schools is a step in that direction. But tuition tax credits, vouchers, anything we can possibly think of that empowers parents with more academic choice and broadens the menu of academic options in a community are steps in the right direction. And we should be advocating all of that. And, all right, so we as parent advocates could agree on that. But these board members that probably, knowing the school district you're talking about, the board members that you encountered that were probably unanimous in their frustration with activist parents showing up at their meetings, even their lives, if they would take the time to think about it, their lives would be made so much easier if they just acknowledged that the minority of parents who showed up at the board meeting with you, there ought to be a place for you, and they should help you go get that so that you can go obtain that thing, that setting in isolation, let's say. And yet the majority of parents who may want something else, they can have that too. I mean, who's not looking for a win-win in any political situation? But the blinders are kind of on these people who get elected to school boards typically, and others in this massive bureaucracy. because they become conditioned to think about the institution and the workers in it first, and the children and families second, almost as afterthoughts. And in that regard, they're farming cash off of children in order to maintain the political structures that they have that result in comfortable lives for a great many of them. And so that needs to be disrupted. You going to board meetings and other parents like you is a great way to start. And it works. There are, look, in Colorado, there are, I think, 178 school districts in our state. There are more than a handful of them. There are a good number of them that are where the community won and voted for school board members who are pro-parent and believe in school choice. And there are very good places. I like that. The media often describes the public education industry in the terms of Gomorrah, and that's sometimes fair, sometimes it's not. But even within its walls, there are good schools to be found, and prudent parents need to take the initiative to fight for the good schools that exist within the walls of a sinful city, and get their kids into better schools and pick the better teachers, the better administrators, and choose them, because there are lots of good actors and good players in this academic environment.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we saw over the last couple of years, I think in particular because of the COVID lockdowns and remote learning and all of the things that came with that. And, that a lot of our kids fell behind because of some of the mandates with the masking, and that created some learning issues. There's a lot of stuff going on. I had an opportunity, I've shared this story before, to sit in on one of my daughter's high school classes. And what I was most concerned with, of course, I'm concerned with young kids getting exposed to hypersexual materials, or even having it. I can't imagine why it's in the schools, to be quite honest with you. I don't know what it has to do with education. But at the same time, what I was most concerned with was kind of this collectivist mob Marxist mentality, where you couldn't have a dissenting opinion about virtually anything that went against kind of this leftist ideology. And my daughter was sharing some differences of opinions with respect to medical freedom. We'll talk a little bit about that, with respect to making decisions about your personal health. And I was appalled at kind of the groupthink, this collectivist idea that you couldn't dissent from the prevailing opinion. That concerns me as much as anything, especially if we're trying to create people who can think for themselves, critically think, rather than just people that recite whatever the latest opinion is. I would rather have my kids be able to think and make decisions on their own. Do you see that happening in our schools? Kind of this indoctrination into a singular way of thinking?
Oh, yes. Yes. This is being promoted and advanced in modern teacher colleges, and many teachers come out of these institutions with the full belief that it is their mission and goal and objective to change society. And to change the culture. That's a fine thing for people to be involved in. I want to be involved in improving the culture. You do too, and most leaders in a community do. But the purpose of a school is academic, and what you have observed, what you just described, are non-academic objectives that a school has established for itself, or that a classroom has established for itself. There are places for that, but in my view, a school is not it. All right, that's my view. In your view, it sounds like you agree. The point is, we ought to be able to choose academic institutions in which we could educate our child. We ought to have more choices where that is where that is the case. And and so many of our friends will say we need to stop what is being taught in one classroom or another. And I reject that. I say, no, there must be parents who want anti-intellectual, non-academic content taught to their kids instead of rigorous academic content. Those parents should have a choice. There should be a place for them. And in our town, they're very fortunate, because that's almost every school in northern Colorado. But for the rest of us, there should be equal and vibrant choices over time.
Yes.
The marketplace will come to the better place for most parents. And most parents will come to realize, well, if I have an option between, cultural socialization and cultural indoctrination, and a place where my kid's going to have a deep dive into history and math, most parents are going to choose the academic option. But there still should be options for those teachers who prefer to teach non-academic content, for parents who prefer non-academic content for their children. I maintain there ought to be choices for them. I'm not for banning anything. I'm not for shutting down options for parents. I'm for creating a marketplace where the best ideas rise to the top, and everybody wants that because their children benefit the most. That's the same viewpoint our founders had, by the way. And so what I'm suggesting, what you're suggesting, is nothing radical. It is in fact very American.
Right. And I think creating that part of the problem is we largely don't have a competitive environment where the resources are available to parents to make those decisions. And it does require parents to sacrifice or to come up with additional resources to do it, or to make decisions to pull their kids out, which become more painful. They're paying taxes into an educational system and they can't take advantage of those resources. So they have to pay on top of that oftentimes to have those options. I think what you're proposing is a truly competitive environment would be $10,000 goes with your kid wherever you choose as a parent to find that best education. Oh my gosh. Katie bar the door, because I think that competitive environment is going to produce world-class education. And those, parents that want their kids to be indoctrinated into socialist ideology, they can choose that. But those of us that don't, and that want them to thrive and to be critical thinkers and be striving for excellence, and by the way, have virtue, which is something that our founding fathers and all of our founders talked a lot about, we would have a much easier option to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we know this to be true. It's not something we have to imagine. Wherever choice is preferred and allowed to thrive, the quality of education tends to soar. There's a new Stanford study that just came out that on charter schools, for example. Now, charter schools is not the full definition of school choice, but charter schools throughout the country studied in isolation shows remarkable progress in academic improvement and results, higher results for children who attend them. I maintain that even when that little bit of choice is allowed to exist within a community, the other schools, regular public schools, just when confronted with the market force, they have different meetings now about how can we improve? How can we keep up? Why are some of our parents leaving here and going there? How can we stop that from happening? And so just introducing choice doesn't mean you have to choose a charter school or go to a private school or use a voucher to go somewhere else. But the fact that so many others can is going to improve the setting and situation, because again, in a marketplace, it forces the most important rational decisions about quality and improvement and cost effectiveness and so on, which in a monopoly are not necessary.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why this educational engagement strategy, where, basically you're advocating for parents and grandparents and others who care about the education of their kids and grandkids to engage fully. And so if you find yourself in a public school environment where you're dissatisfied with the way your children are being educated, then you should engage and make your voice known and engage on scale. Get as many of your neighbors who feel the same way to do that. In the event that you can't make another decision, which I would say there's always another choice, right? Whether it's homeschool or charter or private, there's always a way to find an alternative. But in the event that you feel like you can't, that you're stuck in what I would consider a government school that's teaching in a way that you're not excited about, you have an obligation, a moral obligation to engage and participate. And I think that's the key takeaway, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really believe that what are the institutions that have the greatest, most direct concern and involvement in the family? Those are churches and synagogues, religious institutions. Religious institutions and leaders of them really need to step up, I think, and be completely forceful, unabashed when it comes to supporting families by helping them make these choices. Sometimes taking your kid out of a free, it's not free, but a tuition-free public school and moving them to a more expensive private school is it can be hard to finance. But this is a decision that is at the core of maintaining the integrity of a family. And if churches, synagogues, religious institutions, and let's just say other fraternal organizations in a community really care about the most central and essential unit of society, which is the family, then our missionary efforts, our evangelical efforts ought to be directed more intensively toward fostering families that are in pursuit of a good education, certainly one that does not undermine the values and virtues that are taught at home and reinforced at their church and synagogue.
Yes. Okay. You just, in my opinion, you just came up with an idea that is groundbreaking in some ways, because I've been saying to the churches, hey, start a school or use your church facilities to have co-ops there and have homeschoolers come and meet and, give people options. But what you just suggested was perhaps the church could be engaged in a mission to help fund people's educational choice. So if I'm a member and I've got this family that comes to this church and I want to send them to a school that reinforces my values and my faith standing, what if the church had resources available to help those families make those choices? That's a game changer. And that really is the essence of freedom, right? Is where we're pooling our resources. We're not depending upon the government to do it for us. We're going to take control of that and do it ourselves.
Right. Absolutely. Religious-based schools are the only institutions that can deliver 100% of what an education can be. So I am here in a charter school. It is a public school. It's funded with public funds. And so we are constrained and repressed by our government in delivering a complete education. So I like to say we can only deliver about 80% of what an education should be at this school. Meaning we can't teach religion. We can teach about religion, world religions and so on. But we can't do a deep dive, let's say, into Judaic tradition or Christianity and so on, or Islam or anything like that. But the advantage that I would apply, even in your statement, the reason I think pastors and rabbis in town ought to encourage their families to get into our charter school is because part of our mission is to embrace the non-religious aspect of a government-run school. And when I say fully embrace it, I mean we do not undermine it. We do not supplant religion with other representations of a state religion in a school. The kinds of things that you observed taking place in your daughter's classroom, we reject all of that. This is an institution that focuses just on an academic mission and refuses to teach anything that ventures into what one would consider religion. And so as a result of that, this becomes a very safe place for the people who send their kids here. This school attracts lots of people of faith across the waterfront of all representations. I mean, we've got them all. We got Jews, Christians, Muslims, all of them here. And so we attract people for whom their faith is important because we assert and we are serious about the notion that this school is a government school that at the very least will never undermine what is being taught at home. And so I'm Roman Catholic, so my grandkids can get their religious education elsewhere. But they're not going to come here to school and be told that was wrong. That will never happen. Same with the Jewish families. They will never be told that what they learn at their synagogue is wrong. And so there is great freedom in what I just described, but there is even deeper, more complete education in a religious school that can reinforce what families are learning at home. And so especially children when they're in their formative years, when they're surrounded by a proper message about the human condition, the origins of man, the spiritual nature of the human person, when they're surrounded by that everywhere they go, well, that's a pretty powerful force multiplier that gives that child an even better chance at being well educated as they mature through life.
I love that. And I think it goes back to this idea that you don't want your traditions, your faith, your belief to be undermined. You want to be able to send your kids into an environment that's safe, where I don't have to undo a lot of things that are taught every day. And I can tell you in hundreds of conversations with neighbors, with people in our communities, That is probably the biggest concern, is that they now have to have conversations with their kids that are undoing what they would consider, and what I certainly would consider, an indoctrination into a different worldview, a different belief system. And we have to always be on defense. And it's just it's an exhausting position for parents to be in. And that's why we're engaging, I think, at the level we are. This is all around this idea of freedom versus force, right? It's that the freedom to choose versus being forced to indoctrinate in a certain thing. Let's shift gears from education a little bit, because I know you have a broad spectrum of experience. Let's talk a little bit about medical and health freedom. During the last 2 or 3 years, especially during the COVID challenge, we saw, in my opinion, government use force in ways and on a scale that we have never seen before. We saw mandates, we saw social distancing, we saw restrictions to gatherings. You couldn't meet at churches, but you could certainly go to the bar and the strip club, which never made any sense to me. They were restricting family gatherings for holidays, or trying travel restrictions, business lockdowns. I have never seen the level of sweeping, force, government force, and at the same time, kind of a coordinated censoring and silencing of doctors and anyone who dared to promote an alternative to the situation that we were facing. How was this possible in America? Now, granted, if this was a catastrophic threat, maybe there are reasons to take these types of actions. But how is that type of shutdown, government control, government force, especially through the bureaucracy, right? Because a lot of it was done through public health officials who are unelected bureaucrats. How is that possible in America? And would there ever be a time or circumstance where that made sense, where that would be acceptable?
Well, so a couple questions. How does it happen? Well, fear is a pretty powerful motivator, and fear is a factor that compels compliance in sometimes the most unexplainable, irrational ways. And when you study great leaders, and when I say great, I mean prominent leaders, not good. When you study prominent leaders throughout the history of human civilization, those who are able to manipulate and utilize fear to their advantage are very, very effective. And so, it usually toward the ends of achieving some evil outcome, but it's an effective motivator without question. And then on top of fear is usually inspired by lack of knowledge or some confusion of some sort. And you think when the COVID virus started breaking out, just think of all the questions any rational person would have. And that is, how infectious is it? We heard stories and we knew people who died and so on. And so, is this, and at these points in time, it's possible, you imagine it's possible that a virus of this sort could transform the country and transform everything we love and care about. And so you listen to those who seem to have the most credibility in helping navigate a way through this. And who is that? These are people with MDs and virologists and others who have advanced degrees in the very thing that seems to be threatening us and are empowered by government. As citizens, we put an awful lot of credibility into the hands of scientists plus government workers. And then massive amounts of Americans conforming to all of this. I mean, think of how many of your friends and neighbors were part of a campaign, which in hindsight, we look back, realize it was very uninformed. It was poorly mapped, poorly planned. But some of our friends and neighbors were the ones wagging their fingers and shouting at us to put your mask on or go home or, all that. So you had, there was a popular component of popular compliance and assistance. All right. So, probably the big out of all of this, it should be frightening that so many Americans are willing to abandon their freedom in really easily as it turned out to be. This should be frightening for all of us. But probably even on top of that, probably the greatest miscarriage of justice was the obscene amount of money the federal government spent and is still spending
Yeah.
on a pandemic, an epidemic that was grossly exaggerated in terms of its effect. This is going to be a debt that is going to saddle generations, probably another 2 or 3 generations of Americans. And these dollars are still being spent. And again, when looking back through the audits of how some of these dollars were actually spent, they were spent on things totally unrelated. They were spent with dollars that didn't exist. They turned on the printing press and had to create the dollars to spend in order to propel our country deeper and deeper into debt. And these expenditures are hardly relatable to the supposed crisis at hand. And so, I'm a kind of a throw the bums out sort of person. I think when it comes to election time, I don't care whether you're sympathetic to the cause now or in hindsight, you see the light. If you were there at that point of time and helped preside over this catastrophe, economic catastrophe, political catastrophe, you need to be replaced. So we as voters need to make that happen. And has it ever happened, occurred before? Yes, in various degrees. I mean, certainly there was martial law imposed on the northern states during the Civil War, during the Second World War as well. It'd be a little more recently. There were. I don't know if I'd call it martial law, but there were temporary orders that were in the context of a nation at war that were imposed upon the country that caused us to do Americans at the time to do everything from turn their lights out at a certain time, have curfews, ration their purchases of oil and rubber and butter and, everything else. So there have been times when the country has been compelled to dramatically restrict liberty, excuse me. And, for what was considered to be for the good of the country, more defensible when a country's at war, less defensible when it comes to the government using authority to guess its way through a supposed crisis.
Yeah. And I think now it's interesting, I remember back in the earliest days of the crisis, I remember, following all the rules. I was washing my hands and cleaning the surfaces with all the disinfectants and all the rest of that nonsense, which proved not to matter. And then I wore the mask for a couple of weeks, and we kind of made sure that my daughter, we've got several kids, most are grown, but our youngest daughter was with us, and we kind of made sure that we weren't taking unnecessary risks. We weren't potentially, being exposed in different environments. But then once the truth started to come out about who was really at risk and who wasn't, you learned very quickly that much of this power grab, much of the individual freedoms that we were giving up was unwarranted. And I think that's the caution that I'm kind of fighting against now is, and I think there's probably never been a time with lower levels of trust in leadership in general, in governmental leadership in particular. And that's kind of a sad, kind of casualty of that crisis and the way it was handled. But I think what it's doing now is waking people up to have independent agency over their lives again, to take personal responsibilities for their own decisions that they make. And maybe we'll close with this. President Reagan once said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. And I think you mentioned that in one of the classes. And, that it doesn't get automatically passed on to our children just because they're Americans. It has to be fought for. It has to be protected and handed on. And I heard you recite the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech by Patrick Henry. It was really compelling. Do we need to have that same sense of urgency and passion today to engage in this fight for freedom?
Oh yes. Reagan was right. And Reagan, you might say, paraphrased Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who even at the time they were creating a government, signing a Declaration of Independence and eventually drafting a constitution and getting it ratified. They specifically suggested and stated, and all the best presidents, all the best leaders have since then, in their own words, just as Reagan did, that the only thing preserving and protecting the republic, our country, our philosophy and way of life is you and me and our children and others in our sphere of influence that we know. It's why leadership is so important and when I say leadership, I don't mean government people, even government elected. We call them leaders all the time. We should stop doing that. The president is not our leader. He is a public servant. Everybody in Congress are public servants. Our mayor and our city council, these are all public servants. We are the leaders. And when we fail to understand that, well, then we hand over leadership to somebody who's not really appointed to be that. And in doing so, risk the maintenance of the republic. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. That I think Americanism kind of runs in our DNA, but it will vanish like all flames. Sometimes they do blow out if they're not strong enough and if they're not protected enough. And this one can easily, just as Reagan suggested. So that's why everything we've discussed. That's why maintaining our freedom and our independence when it comes to healthcare is so central and essential. Maintaining a strong economy is essential. In my volunteer life through a leadership program of the Rockies, I focus on the leadership capacity of adults in our state and in our community and in other states where LPR exists now. And then in my day job here at a school, I'm headmaster of a school that covers kindergarten through 12th grade. So we've got 1,500 kids in the school at any given time. And this is what I think is important, how I want to spend my time and what I want to devote myself to is giving them a fighting chance to be wise enough to be strong Americans, free Americans, sufficient to help maintain and sustain our glorious republic.
Yes. So, and maybe that's the best way, you just gave great examples of the way you're engaging. And that's part of what I admire about you is that your life has a theme of trying to, protect individual liberties and make our communities as strong as they can be. For everybody that's in our neighborhoods and our communities, what are one or two or three things that they can do to actively engage in protecting individual liberties and the country that we love so much?
Well, I think, look, not everybody has to run a school or run the leadership program of the Rockies or be a college professor or be a teacher. Any walk of life is a suitable station for being on this battlefield. And it is a worthy battlefield. I mean, you have to do it. So my point being is if you run a small business, if you're involved in ministry, if you're in the media, if you are just the head of your household and leader in your house, everywhere we go, there is a sphere of influence we can have if we aspire to first understand it, care about it, and love it, and all the people that we encounter, and then look, there's great conflict in political and religious discussions. We know this. I mean, the warning we all get, never talk about church and politics at the dinner table, or especially when you're all together at a Christmas holiday or whatever. All right. But if we take all of these roles seriously, everything we're involved in, we have to gingerly step into these conversations. And I would submit anywhere we happen to be. At LPR, we talk about our sphere of influence, our orbit that we are in, and we talk about our proximity influence. We talk about power sneezing, and all that it means is that we're infecting others with good ideas, and that takes some finesse. You've got to be careful about the words. We don't want to be in people's faces. We want to choose. We want to choose the right words that we know will resonate with a reasonable person. And so, so that's my advice. So many, I run into so many business owners who have employees, and they say, I can't talk about this with my employees. And I think to myself, why not? You have to, because they are voters. Some of them are writing checks to the politicians who are trying to destroy your business. Some of them are promoting virtues and values that are are imperiling your children and you can't be neutral. God never intended any of us to be neutral in a society. There are places for people who want that role. It's called hermits. So you go live in a cave and you don't interact with anyone. But for the rest of us, there's great joy. There's great joy in interacting with wherever we happen to be. And what should we be doing? We should be leading cheerfully and enjoying the notion of trying to engage to the greatest intellectual ability we have talents to do in important topics in conversation and talk about how we should live. That is exactly the topic any leader should be discussing. And to the extent we can do this through conversation rather than shooting at one another, well, that's the gift and legacy of not only the founding fathers, but every warrior who ever put on a uniform and went to the front lines first so that we could have civil conversations. If they sacrificed all that and we fail to engage in a civil conversation, that is an insult to everyone who's ever shed blood on a battlefield for American values. And so don't be the person who takes all that for granted and gives our republic away through a little bit of fear, a little bit of intimidation, a little discomfort, maybe. Be cheerful about it. That's what an American is. We need to live like them.
I love it. Hey, thanks for that charge. I mean, I knew you were going to inspire our listeners to engage, and that's what it's going to take. It's going to take that courageous engagement. No topic is off limits. Be a person of integrity. Live that integrity out in all of your relationships. Bob, thanks so much for investing in us. I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you, Jimmy. Appreciate you too.
You bet.